She was sold to a man the world had already buried. Clara Whitmore, 26 years old, no connections, no beauty that stopped traffic, no power of her own, handed over to Vittorio Valenti like a check written to cover a debt. The most feared name in the Italian underworld, a man who hadn't stood on his own 2 feet in 3 years. His enemies called him finished. His allies were already choosing sides. And Clara? Clara was supposed to be the final proof that the king was done. Nobody warned her that the most dangerous man she would ever meet would be the one sitting perfectly still in a wheelchair, watching her walk through his door like he had been expecting her his entire life. If this story reaches you tonight, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Every word of this matters. The flight from Chicago had been 7 hours of recycled air and bad coffee, and Clara Whitmore spent most of it staring at the emergency exit door, wondering what would happen if she simply pulled the handle. She didn't pull it. That was the thing about Clara. She thought about the exit every single time. She just never used it. Her father had called it a gift. Her mother, before she left, had called it stupidity dressed up as loyalty. Clara had never decided which one of them was right. She sat in the middle seat between a heavy-set businessman who smelled of garlic and a teenage boy with headphones who hadn't acknowledged her existence since boarding, and she pressed her forehead against the headrest and tried very hard not to think about what was waiting for her in Milan. A man in a wheelchair, a contract with her name on it, a family that had signed both without her permission. She had found out 11 days ago. That was how long she had known that her father, Gerald Whitmore, former investment director, current catastrophe, had borrowed money from the Valenti organization 4 years earlier. Serious money. The kind of money that didn't come with interest rates, it came with conditions. The kind of conditions that got enforced in parking garages at 2 in the morning. Gerald had paid on time for 3 years. Then his fund collapsed, and he stopped paying. And the conditions changed, and Clara had come home from her shift at the university library to find 2 men in expensive suits sitting in her father's kitchen drinking his coffee like they owned the house, which, it turned out, they effectively did. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't cried, at least not in front of them. She had stood in the doorway in her coat with her bag still on her shoulder and looked at her father and asked him very quietly, what had he done? He hadn't been able to look at her. The taller of the 2 men had explained the arrangement in the way someone reads from a document, flat and without apology. The Valenti family was willing to consider the debt settled. All outstanding obligations, including the house, her father's remaining accounts, and the associated legal exposure from the fund collapse, would be cleared. In exchange, one condition would be met. Clara would enter into a formal marriage arrangement with Vittorio Valenti. Duration minimum 2 years. Conduct expected to be appropriate to her position. She would want for nothing material. She had asked them if they were serious. The shorter man had smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach anything above the mouth. She had looked at her father again. Gerald Whitmore had looked at the table. That was 11 days ago, and now the wheels of the plane touched Italian tarmac with a hard jolt that snapped Clara's teeth together, and she grabbed the armrest and breathed through her mouth until the shaking stopped. The businessman beside her had already unbuckled. The boy with the headphones was texting. Outside the oval window, the Milan sky was flat gray, low clouds sitting on the horizon like something pressed down by weight. She had one carry-on bag. She had packed it herself, the night before the flight, in the bedroom she had lived in since she was 8 years old. She had left most of her things. There hadn't seemed to be much point in bringing them. The woman who owned those things, the woman with a routine, a library ID badge, a Tuesday night cooking class she actually enjoyed, that woman wasn't going to exist in the same way on the other side of this. The car was waiting outside arrivals. Black, long driver who did not introduce himself. He took her bag without asking, put it in the trunk, opened the rear door, and stood beside it until she got in. She got in. The door closed. The city moved past the tinted windows. Clara watched it and tried to memorize details. The color of the buildings. The way the light hit the wet pavement. She had never been to Italy. She had been to Canada twice, and once to Mexico for a conference her university department had funded. That was the full extent of her international experience. And now she was in a black car in Milan being driven to a man whose photograph she had found on her phone at 1 in the morning 4 days ago, sitting in her father's kitchen, unable to sleep. The photograph had been taken at some kind of formal event, maybe 5 years back. Vittorio Valenti standing, he had been able to stand then, in a dark suit at what looked like a private dinner. He was not what she had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Something cruder, maybe. Something that looked more openly like danger. Instead, the photograph showed a man in his late 40s, tall and lean, with dark hair gone silver at the temples, jaw set hard, eyes that caught the camera without any warmth whatsoever. Not handsome in a conventional way. Not ugly, either. The kind of face that didn't ask you what you thought of it. The kind of face that had already decided it didn't care. That photograph was from before the attack. She knew the outline of the story because the two men in her father's kitchen had told her, probably to make the situation feel less strange than it was, though it had not accomplished that. 18 months ago, Vittorio Valenti had been targeted in what was described to her as an internal matter. Someone close to him. Someone trusted. There had been an ambush at a location she was not told. He had survived. Others had not. The physical damage to his spine had left him unable to walk. He had spent the following year withdrawing from public functions, delegating, managing from his estate. The people who ran competing operations had begun testing his boundaries, taking liberties, sending messages. The marriage arrangement, the shorter man had explained, served organizational purposes. It demonstrated stability. It demonstrated that Vittorio Valenti still made decisions about his own life. It sent a message. Clara had not asked what message. She had been afraid the answer would make her feel even more like a prop. The car left the city after 40 minutes and moved onto roads that narrowed through countryside. The gray had not lifted. The fields on either side were brown and flat and enormous. Clara's hands were in her lap and she was pressing her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger hard enough to leave a small crescent mark, something she had done since childhood when she was trying not to show anything on her face. She pressed it and watched the fields and did not let herself cry. The estate appeared without warning after a curve in the road. A gate, iron and high, set into stone walls. Security cameras mounted at the corners. Two men standing at the gatehouse who looked at the car and then opened the gate without speaking into a radio. Inside the walls, the driveway was lined with old trees, bare in the November cold, their branches reaching toward each other overhead like something that had learned to survive in this particular light. The house at the end was stone, 3 stories, older than anything Clara had grown up around. Not a showpiece, something that had been built to last and had. The car stopped. The driver got out and opened her door. Clara didn't move for a moment. She sat and looked at the front of the house and felt the thumbnail digging in and made herself stop. Then she got out. The air was cold and smelled like wet stone and something else she couldn't name. A man was waiting at the top of the front steps. Not Vittorio. This was younger, sharp-featured, dark jacket, the kind of deliberately neutral expression that meant he was paid to have it. He introduced himself as Marco, assistant to Mr. Valenti, and he did not offer to shake her hand. He told her she would be shown to her rooms and that Mr. Valenti would receive her at 6 o'clock. It was currently 3:47. She followed him inside. The interior was not what movies and television had trained her to expect from organized crime wealth. There was no marble everywhere, no gold fixtures, no aggressive display of what money could buy. It was instead the kind of interior that had been furnished over decades by people who understood what they were looking at. Dark wood, heavy rugs, paintings that were old enough to have history in them, a staircase with a banister worn smooth by generations of hands. It was cold in the way that stone buildings are cold when the heat hasn't fully reached the outer rooms yet. Clara's footsteps were loud. Marco's were not. Her rooms were on the second floor. A sitting room, a bedroom, a bathroom. Clean, adequate. Someone had placed a vase of flowers on the desk in the sitting room, white and without scent. Clara looked at them for a long time after Marco left, standing in her coat with her bag still over one shoulder. She thought about who had put them there and why, and whether it was kindness or theater. She couldn't decide. She dropped her bag and sat on the edge of the bed and put her hands flat on her thighs and looked at the floor. 2 years. She was going to have to survive 2 years. At 5:50, she washed her face, changed into the least wrinkled thing in her bag, which was a navy wool dress she'd bought for a faculty dinner 3 years ago and worn twice, and went back downstairs because she didn't know what else to do, and standing in a strange room waiting felt worse than moving. Marco met her at the bottom of the stairs and led her through a corridor to a set of double doors and knocked, and a voice said to come in, and Marco opened the door and stepped aside. Clara walked in. The room was a study. Large, with bookshelves covering 2 walls and a fireplace burning low on the third, and a desk positioned so that whoever sat behind it could see the door. The windows behind the desk showed the darkening countryside and the last band of gray light at the horizon. The room smelled like wood smoke and paper, and very faintly like something medicinal that someone had tried to air out. Vittorio Valenti was behind the desk. He was not in the wheelchair. He was in a specialized chair that allowed more natural positioning, and she registered this without being sure if it changed anything. He was bigger than the photograph had suggested, broader through the shoulders, and the silver in his hair was more pronounced now. The face was the same. The eyes were the same. He looked at her as she crossed the room with an expression that gave away exactly nothing, and Clara felt the thumbnail instinct fire and suppressed it and made herself walk straight and meet his eyes. She stopped 3 feet from the desk and didn't speak first because she didn't know what to say. And she had learned a long time ago that silence was not always the same as weakness. He looked at her for a long moment. Not an inspection exactly, something more considered than that. "Clara Whitmore," he said. His voice was low and carried the texture of someone accustomed to not needing volume to be heard. The accent on her name was slight, Italian structure under American cadence, which meant he had spent time in the States or had been educated there or both. "Yes," she said. "You're thinner than your photograph." That was not what she had expected. "The photograph in your file." "My father's file." He looked at her steadily. "Sit down." There was a chair positioned across from the desk. She sat. He didn't move from behind it, and she registered that too. The desk between them was not accidental. It was a position. It communicated something specific and deliberate. "You were not told the full details of this arrangement," he said. It was not a question. "I was told enough. You were told what your father was told to tell you. That and the men who visited your house." He picked up a pen from the desk, turned it once between his fingers, set it down. "I'm going to tell you the rest." "All right. You are not a hostage. You are not here as punishment. You are not here because I needed to acquire something I couldn't otherwise obtain." He paused. "You are here because there are people inside and outside of this organization who believe that I am no longer a viable decision-maker, and a man who is visibly diminished in the way I am, who enters this phase of his life alone and without continuity, confirms that belief. This arrangement provides a counter-narrative. That is the organizational reason." Clara looked at him. The fire made a small sound. "And the personal reason?" Something shifted in his expression. "Not much. Just enough. Your father was not randomly selected. His situation was brought to my attention specifically because of your background. You have a graduate degree in financial analysis. You were 22 credit hours from completing a second degree in behavioral psychology before you withdrew to support your family during the initial stages of your father's fund problems. Dan Mishaimpatchan. He stopped. "I am aware that you withdrew the graduate funding application you had submitted to 3 universities last spring in order to remain in Chicago." She had not expected him to know that. The thumbnail was pressing in very hard, and she was not going to let it show. "Why does my education matter to this arrangement?" "Because I do not need decoration," he said plainly. "I need someone who can function in rooms where I cannot always be, and who understands what she is looking at when she gets there." He leaned back slightly. "That is the personal reason." Silence. Clara looked at the desk, and then at the fire, and then back at him. "You could have said all of this to my father. You could have made this an actual offer instead of a condition attached to a debt." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" "Because you would not have come," he said. She opened her mouth and then closed it because that was honest enough to stop her. "You had no reason to," he continued. "You had a life, even a constrained one. You were not going to accept a business proposition from a man like me for abstract reasons. The arrangement had to remove your alternatives first." He did not say it with apology. He said it like he was describing a problem he had solved. "I'm not asking you to be grateful for that." "Good," Clara said. "Because I'm not." The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, Something more involuntary than that, gone almost before it appeared. No, I didn't expect you would be. She sat in the chair in the navy dress she'd worn to a faculty dinner 3 years ago and looked at the most feared man she had ever been in a room with, and felt something shift inside her chest that wasn't fear and wasn't comfort, and wasn't anything she had a name for yet. "What exactly are you expecting me to do?" she asked. "Learn," he said. "Observe. Attend functions with me. Handle correspondence that requires a personal rather than organizational voice. In time, manage certain meetings on behalf of our shared interests." Our shared interests. You benefit from this arrangement as much as I do, once you understand it fully. Your father's debts are cleared. Your family's legal exposure ends. You receive a salary, an actual one, paid to your personal account, not contingent on behavior. He picked up the pen again. And in 2 years, if you choose to leave, you leave with enough established to build whatever comes next. And if I want to leave before 2 years, he looked at her. The door is not locked. She didn't believe that entirely, but she noted that he had said it. "I want it in writing," she said. "All of it. What's expected, what's protected, what the exit looks like. I want a lawyer I choose, not one you provide." He studied her for a moment in which she was quite sure he was deciding whether to be irritated. He didn't appear to be. "Agreed," he said. "Marco will arrange it. Tonight." A pause. Then, "Tonight." She stood, because the interview, that was what it had been, she realized, felt complete, and she didn't know how to extend it and didn't want to appear to be trying. He watched her stand without comment. "One more thing," she said. "Yes. The people you said believe you're no longer viable." She met his eyes. "Do they know about this arrangement yet?" "Not yet." "When will they?" "When I decide it is useful for them to know." She nodded once, turned to go, got 3 steps toward the door. "Miss Whitmore?" She stopped but didn't turn around immediately. "Clara," she said. "If we're going to do this, use my name." Silence behind her. Then, "Clara." She turned. He was watching her with that same expression that gave nothing away, except now she thought she could see something working underneath it, something measuring, something that had not quite made its conclusion yet. "The flowers in your room," he said. "I told them to put those there, in case you were—" "I told them to put them there." She looked at him. She was not sure what to do with that. She was not sure he was sure what to do with it either. "Okay," she said. She left the room. She walked back up the stairs to the 2nd floor and went into her sitting room and closed the door and stood in the middle of the room with the white flowers on the desk and the cold window showing nothing but her own reflection and her father's voice in her head saying, "It's the only way, Clara. It's the only way." And she breathed and breathed until the pressure behind her eyes faded. Then she took off her coat, draped it over the chair, and opened her bag and began unpacking, because however she felt about it, she was here now, and this room was going to have to be real. She had been in bed for less than an hour when she heard it, voices below, urgent and not bothering to stay quiet. She couldn't make out words through the floor. She lay still and listened and heard footsteps, several sets of them, moving fast through the corridor on the ground level. Then a door. Then silence. She waited. 20 minutes later, she heard a car engine, then another, then nothing. She got up and went to her window and looked out at the driveway. 2 black cars were gone. The gate at the end of the driveway was still swinging closed. She stood there in the dark with her hand on the cold glass and thought about Vittorio Valenti sitting in that study saying the door is not locked. And then she thought about the way he'd stopped mid-sentence when he mentioned the flowers. And then she thought about the 2 men in her father's kitchen who had smiled with only the lower half of their faces, and she understood for the first time and very clearly that she had walked into something that was still actively moving, that whatever she had stepped into the middle of was not resolved, was not settled, was not finished. And somewhere in this house, in the dark, in the cold stone, Vittorio Valenti was dealing with something he had not told her about, something that could not wait until morning. Clara did not sleep. She lay on top of the covers in her clothes and listened to the house and watched the ceiling and told herself that whatever had sent 2 cars out into the November dark at 11 o'clock at night was not her problem. She was here under a contract. She was here because her father had made catastrophic decisions, and someone had decided she was the most useful solution to those decisions. She was not here to involve herself in whatever operational crisis was unfolding 2 floors below her. She told herself that for approximately 40 minutes. Then she got up, found her shoes, and went downstairs. The ground floor was not empty. A man she hadn't seen before was stationed at the end of the main corridor, arms crossed, jacket open enough to show the shape of something holstered underneath it. He looked at her with an expression that was not hostile and not welcoming, and was very specifically designed to communicate that she had arrived at the edge of a boundary. "I want water," she said. "Is the kitchen accessible, or do I need written permission for that too?" He looked at her for a moment, then stepped aside and pointed left. The kitchen was large and stone-floored and cold in a way the rest of the house was not. Someone had left a light on over the stove. Clara found a glass, filled it at the sink, and stood there drinking it and looking at the window over the basin, which showed her nothing but her own reflection and the dark beyond it. She could hear voices somewhere, not in the kitchen, not close, but in the house, low and serious and continuous. She set down the glass. She followed the voices. The corridor past the kitchen ran toward the back of the house. At the end of it, a door was partially open, yellow light spilling through the gap. Clara stopped 6 feet short of it and stood still and listened, because she wasn't foolish enough to walk directly through a partially open door in this house without knowing what was on the other side. Vittorio's voice first, controlled but with something compressed inside it, the sound of a man holding a very heavy thing at arm's length. Then another voice, older, rougher, a voice that belonged to someone who had never in his life chosen diplomacy when aggression was available. "Can't be managed from here, Vittorio. You know what they're saying." "I know exactly what they're saying." "Then you know that Caruso is not going to wait. He moved on the Brescia route 2 days ago. Our people there either stepped aside or—" "I know what happened in Brescia." A pause. The sound of something being set down hard on a surface. "You need to be there. In person. You need to show them—" "Show them what?" Not a question. Flat, quiet in a way that was more dangerous than volume. Silence on the other end of that. "I know what you think I need to show them, Enzo," Vittorio said. "I've been hearing it for 14 months. Show them you're still standing, except I'm not. And every man in 3 provinces knows it, so tell me what exactly I'm supposed to show them. That you can still burn something down when you have to." Another silence, different texture. "Go home," Vittorio said. "I'll contact you in the morning." "Vittorio, go home." Clara took 3 quiet steps backward and turned and went back to the kitchen and stood at the sink and turned the water on and off and on again so that if anyone came through the corridor, they would find her there, doing a normal thing, not standing outside a door learning things she had not been invited to learn. Nobody came. She went back upstairs. In the morning, the house felt different, not lighter. The November sky was the same flat gray, the same cold pressing at the window glass, but inhabited in a more deliberate way. When she came down at 7:30, the dining room had been set for 2, and Vittorio was already there. He was in the wheelchair today, not the specialized desk chair from the study. The manual one, which she had expected to be smaller somehow. In her mind, she had imagined something hospital-adjacent, something institutional. It wasn't. It was a serious piece of equipment, well-maintained, and he navigated it without any of the self-consciousness she had unconsciously anticipated. He was at the head of the table, reading something on a tablet, dressed already, dark shirt, no tie. He looked up when she came in. "You were awake last night," he said. "I was thirsty." He looked at her. "I was also awake," she said. He did not look surprised that she had amended it. He set the tablet face down on the table. "Sit." She sat. Coffee appeared from somewhere. A woman, 50s, who moved through the room without making eye contact with either of them and left as efficiently as she had arrived. Clara wrapped both hands around the cup. "What is the Brescia route?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, but not in the way that meant he was deciding whether to answer. More like he was deciding how much of the answer was worth giving. "Transportation infrastructure, northern supply chain, it's been ours for 12 years. And it isn't anymore. Parts of it aren't. Because of Caruso." He looked at her steadily. "You were at the kitchen doorway for approximately 4 minutes before you went back," he said. "The man at the end of the hall told me." Clara did not move. She could feel her pulse pick up slightly, and she kept her face even. "Are you angry about it?" No. He picked up his coffee. I'm telling you that I know because I want you to understand the nature of this house. Specifically that very little happens in it that I am not informed of, including my drinking water. Including that. She looked at him across the table. The morning light was flat and gray, and it showed the lines in his face clearly, the ones that had been less visible in the warmer light of the study the night before. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who had not slept, and was not going to acknowledge it. The man you were talking to, she said. Enzo. My operations director, 23 years. He thinks you should go to Brescia. He thinks many things. Do you? The silence this time had a different weight to it. He set his cup down and looked at the window, and she watched his jaw tighten and release. A small, controlled movement, like something he had learned to do instead of something else. It is not a simple question, he said. I'm not asking for a simple answer. He looked back at her. Something in his expression changed, very slightly, but she was watching closely enough to catch it, like she had said something that landed somewhere unexpected. Caruso's position is that the restructuring of the Brescia operation is a natural consequence of changed circumstances, he said. His argument, made to the other families at a meeting I was not present for 3 weeks ago, is that an organization without active and visible leadership requires practical support from neighboring structures until stability is restored. Subtis by Gosai. He's absorbing your territory and calling it a favor. Yes. And the other families accepted that framing. Publicly. He picked up the tablet, turned it once, set it down again. There are 2 who did not, who have reached out privately. But private support and public support are different things in this world, and everyone at that table knows it. Clara drank her coffee and thought about this. The woman who had brought it reappeared with bread and something that smelled like eggs and set both on the table and left again. Outside the window, the bare trees were moving slightly in a wind that hadn't reached the house yet. Who was on the other side of Brescia, she said, when it was yours? He looked at her. What do you mean? I mean, who ran it for you? On the ground, who are the people who've been there for 12 years and are now watching Caruso's people move in? He was quiet for a moment that felt different from the other ones. Why? Because if Caruso is calling it a temporary support structure, the people on the ground have a choice to make about whether they believe him or not. And that choice is based on which side looks more permanent. She looked at him across the table. You need them to not believe him. That's the actual problem. Not whether you show up. Whether the people who've worked under your name for 12 years think your name still means something when you're not in the room. Vittorio looked at her. She looked back. Eat something, he said after a moment. She ate something. He watched her for the rest of the meal with an expression she couldn't fully read, which she was beginning to understand was his default state. But it was different from the night before. Last night it had been evaluative, a man assessing an unknown variable. This morning it was something more active, something that was working. Marco appeared at 8:45 with a schedule. Clara received a copy, which she had not expected. She looked at it at the table after Vittorio had moved to the study. Her name appeared on 3 items: a meeting with the estate's administrative staff at 10, a fitting appointment in the city at 2, which she had not been consulted about and felt a specific way about, and a dinner that evening described as household, informal. She went to find Marco. He was in the corridor outside the study, which she was learning was his habitual position near the door but not through it. The fitting appointment, she said. Yes. What is it for? There's an event next week, a formal dinner. The Castellano family hosts it annually. Mr. Valenti attends. I don't need someone to dress me. Marco looked at her with the carefully neutral expression of a man who had been asked to communicate something he personally agreed with to someone who was not going to like hearing it. The Castellano dinner has a particular atmosphere. Certain appearances are part of that atmosphere. The atmosphere where everyone looks at Vittorio and decides whether he's still worth respecting. A pause. The dinner is significant, Marco said carefully, and I'm supposed to look the part. You're supposed to look like someone who chose to be there, he said. There is a difference. Clara looked at him. He was better at this than she had initially given him credit for. Fine, she said, but I choose what I wear. Someone can come with options. Marco nodded once. She got the impression he had been prepared for some version of this conversation and had been relieved to reach the end of it. The meeting with the administrative staff was 12 people around a long table in a room she hadn't been in yet, off the East Wing. Household management, security coordination, 2 people who handled what was described as external communications. They looked at her with a range of expressions that included cautious, skeptical, professionally blank, and in one case, a woman about her own age with dark eyes and a quality of stillness that Clara noted immediately, something that might have been genuine curiosity. Clara shook hands, learned names, asked 2 questions about the estate's organizational structure that were more pointed than anyone seemed to expect, and left. On her way out, the woman with the dark eyes fell into step beside her. "Lucia," the woman said, "I handle the household accounts." "Clara, I know who you are." "I assumed." They walked a few steps. "You're not what people expected," Lucia said. "What did they expect? Someone quieter." She glanced at Clara sideways. "Someone easier to overlook." Clara looked back at her. "Is that a warning?" "It's an observation." Lucia stopped at the corridor junction. "The easier you are to overlook, the safer you are here." She paused. "Usually." Then she turned and went the other way. Clara stood at the junction and thought about that for a moment. Then she went to find Vittorio. He was in the study with Enzo. She knocked, which felt strange, and waited, and Marco opened the door and looked at her, and looked back into the room, and Vittorio said to let her in. Enzo was standing. He was a big man, late 60s, with a face that had the quality of old leather, durable and creased and communicating exactly nothing it didn't intend to communicate. He looked at Clara the way someone looks at a complication that has arrived at an inconvenient moment. "I need 5 minutes," she said to Vittorio. "Now is not," Enzo started. "Enzo," Vittorio said, without raising his voice. Enzo stopped. "5 minutes," Vittorio said to Clara. She crossed to the desk. She didn't sit. She put both hands on the surface and leaned slightly forward and kept her voice low and direct. "The Brescia situation. The people who've been running that operation for 12 years. I need their names, and I need to understand what their specific concerns are right now. Not operationally, personally. Whether they think this is temporary or permanent. Whether anyone has contacted them privately since Caruso moved." Vittorio was very still. "Why?" "Because the Castellano dinner is in a week, and you're going to walk in. You're going to arrive, and every person in that room is going to be performing their assessment of your position in real time. And the Brescia situation is the loudest piece of evidence on the table." She looked at him steadily. "But if the people running Brescia are visibly still aligned with you, if they've made decisions in the past week that demonstrate that alignment, then Caruso's narrative about temporary support becomes something else. It becomes overreach, and overreach is something the other families have opinions about." Silence. Enzo made a sound that was not quite a word. Clara did not look at him. Vittorio looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Enzo. Something passed between them. Not words, something older and more practiced than words. The communication of 2 people who had been in the same room for a very long time. Enzo looked at Clara with an expression that had shifted, not warm, not welcoming, but different from how he had looked at her when she came in. "The names," Vittorio said to Enzo. Enzo pulled out his phone. The next 4 days were the strangest of Clara's life, which was saying something given the trajectory of the previous 2 weeks. She was not included in everything. There were rooms she did not enter, and calls that were made without her present, and decisions that reached her only in their effects. But Vittorio began including her in more than she had been prepared for. Meetings where she sat and listened, and afterward he asked her what she had observed. Correspondence she was given to read and asked to characterize, not the content, but the tone, the intent beneath the words, what the writer was trying to accomplish versus what they claimed to be accomplishing. She was good at it. She knew she was good at it, had always known, in the way that you know you're good at something when the knowledge is more uncomfortable than satisfying because you've never had the right context for it. She had spent years reading people in small rooms, library committees, department politics, her father's dinners with clients where she had sat quietly and watched and known, every time, which person in the room wanted something they weren't saying out loud. This was the same skill in a much higher stakes room. Vittorio watched her do it and did not comment directly, but she could feel the recalibration happening day by day, the way you feel a scale shifting without seeing the mechanism. On the third day, she made a mistake. She was reviewing correspondence from a man named Ferretti, who had sent a letter through formal channels that was warm and supportive and offered assistance with a transportation contract that overlapped with the Brescia operation. Clara read it twice and then told Vittorio that Ferretti was the problem. Vittorio looked up from the document he was reading. "He's too warm," she said. "The language is too careful. He's not being generous. He's marking a position. He wants to be on record as having offered support before something happens, so when it does happen, he can point to the letter." Vittorio was quiet. "Before what happens?" "I don't know, but he knows something." Silence. She could feel Enzo looking at her from across the room. Vittorio said slowly, "Ferretti has been a reliable ally for 9 years." "I know," she said. "That's why the letter is so concerning." More silence. Enzo made a sound that was barely audible, something that wasn't quite dismissal, but occupied the same territory. "She's been here 4 days," Enzo said. Not loudly, conversationally, which was somehow worse. Clara looked at him. "I know. You're reading a letter written in Italian, which Marco translated for you, and telling us that a man with 9 years of consistent relationship is a problem because the letter is too warm." Enzo tilted his head slightly. "That is what you're saying?" "Yes." "And you have what—" He gestured, loose and deliberate, in a way that encompassed her navy dress, her carry-on bag, her 4 days of existence in this house. "A degree." "2," she said. "Almost." Enzo looked at Vittorio. Vittorio had not moved. He was watching the exchange with that expression she had come to recognize, the one that was working, processing, running something through a mechanism she couldn't see. "I'll have Ferretti looked into," he said. Enzo straightened. Not quite a reaction, but close. "Vittorio, I said I'll have it looked into." The room went quiet. Enzo picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, which was the closest he came to expressing the fullness of what he thought about this, and left. Clara stood where she was and breathed. "You might be wrong," Vittorio said. "I know." "If you are, it creates a problem with someone I don't have the capacity to make problems with right now." "I know that too." She looked at him. "I'm still not wrong." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he went back to his document, which he had learned was as close as he came to saying that a conversation had reached its conclusion. She was not wrong. 48 hours later, Ferretti's name came up in a communication intercepted from one of Caruso's people. It was indirect, phrased in the way that people who are careful phrase things they don't want to be quoted on, but the shape of it was clear. Ferretti had been in contact with Caruso's organization for at minimum 6 weeks. The warmth of his letter was exactly what she had identified. A position marker, a placeholder, a flag stuck in ground he was preparing to give away. Marco brought her the information in the sitting room. She was reading, or trying to. He handed her a single printed page and stood there while she read it and waited. She read it twice. "Where is he?" she said. "The study." She went to the study. She knocked. She went in. Vittorio had the same report on his desk, and he had been looking at it, and now he was looking at her, and the expression on his face was not triumphant and not grateful, and was not going to be either of those things. It was something tighter and more serious, and located in the part of a person that deals in implications. "Caruso knows about the Castellano dinner," he said. "Ferretti told him. He knows we'll be there. He knows the arrangement, our arrangement, was going to be presented there for the first time." He set the paper down. "He is planning something." Clara stood still. "He is planning something," Vittorio repeated, "and the only advantage we have is that he does not know we know." He paused. "And he does not know what you are actually capable of." She looked at him. "What am I actually capable of?" He looked back. "That is what we are about to find out." She stood in the study in the gray afternoon light and felt the shift complete itself beneath her feet, the moment where the ground she had been standing on became something else. Not solid and not unstable, but moving, carrying her forward without asking her permission. And she understood that the woman who had pressed her thumbnail into her index finger on a transatlantic flight and wondered about emergency exits was standing here now, and there was no emergency exit in this room, and hadn't been since the moment she walked through the front door. "Tell me what Caruso's people look like," she said. "I want to know who I'm walking into that room with." Vittorio picked up his phone. Outside the study windows, the first snow of the season had begun to fall on the empty fields, thin and quiet and relentless, covering everything that had been visible before. And somewhere in the city, a man named Ferretti was sitting with his choices and didn't know yet that Ferretti's letter had already been read by the wrong people. That was the sentence Clara finished in her own head, standing in the study doorway as the snow came down outside, and Vittorio was already on the phone, his voice low and clipped, and moving fast through a list of instructions that Marco was writing without being asked. She stood there for a moment in which nobody needed her, and she was therefore briefly invisible, and she used that moment to look at Vittorio's face and understand something she had not fully understood before. He was afraid, not in the way that showed, not in the way that made noise. It was in the set of his shoulders, the angle of his jaw, the speed at which his eyes were moving across the room without landing on anything. The fear of a man who has calculated the odds and found them changed and is now doing the only thing he knows how to do with that information, which is move faster. She went back to her sitting room and sat down and thought. The Castellano dinner was in 4 days. Caruso knew they were coming. Caruso knew the arrangement was going to be made public there for the first time. Vittorio arriving with Clara at his side. The visual statement of continuity and stability, and a man who had rebuilt something around himself. Caruso had been planning around that dinner. Ferretti had been feeding him information for at least 6 weeks, which meant the planning had started before Clara even arrived, before the arrangement had been confirmed, which meant Caruso had anticipated this move before Vittorio had fully made it. That was the part that unsettled her most. She was on her feet again without deciding to stand. She went back to the study. Vittorio was off the phone. Marco had left. Enzo was back, standing near the window with his arms crossed, and his face carrying the specific expression of a man who had been proven wrong about something and was dealing with it by being very still and very quiet. "How long has Enzo known about Ferretti?" Clara said. The room went still. Enzo looked at her, not with anger, something colder than anger. "What?" "I'm not asking to be aggressive," she said. "I need to understand the timeline. Ferretti has been in contact with Caruso for 6 weeks. The information we intercepted tonight, how did we intercept it? Who is running that surveillance, and when did it start, and what else has come through it?" Vittorio was watching her. His expression had shifted into something very focused. "Enzo runs communications surveillance," he said. "I know," Clara said. Another silence. Enzo moved his jaw once like he was working something out between his back teeth. "The tap on Caruso's secondary communications line has been running for 3 months. And Ferretti's name came up for the first time tonight." "Yes. So for 6 weeks, while Ferretti was communicating with Caruso's people, it wasn't on that line." She looked at Enzo steadily. "He was using a different channel, one you weren't watching." Enzo said nothing. "Which means someone told him which channel was being watched," she said, "so he could avoid it." The silence in the room changed texture. Vittorio's hands were very still on the desk. "That's a significant accusation," Enzo said. His voice was flat, not defensive, flat in the way of someone who has decided to treat something as beneath response while their body communicates that it is not. "I'm not accusing you, Clara said. "I'm describing a gap. Someone told Ferretti which channel to avoid. That might be you. It might be someone in your department. It might be someone who overheard the wrong conversation at the wrong time." She paused. "But the gap is real." Vittorio looked at Enzo. Enzo looked at Vittorio. 23 years of something passed between them in approximately 4 seconds, and Clara watched it happen and held very still and did not look away. "Get me a full log," Vittorio said. "Everything through that line for the past 8 weeks. Every communication, every contact flagged by personnel access." Enzo straightened. It was a small movement with significant weight behind it. "You're asking me to document my own department." "I'm asking you to help me find the gap," Vittorio said. "If you can't do that, tell me now." Another silence. Longer. Clara counted her own heartbeats without meaning to. 4, 5. I'll have it by morning, Enzo said. He left. Clara stood in the quiet study and listened to his footsteps move down the corridor and eventually disappear, and then she exhaled slowly and looked at Vittorio and found him already looking at her. That was necessary, she said. I'm not apologizing for it. I didn't ask you to. He reached for the glass of water on his desk and drank from it and set it back down, and the small, ordinary normalcy of the gesture made her suddenly acutely aware of how cold the room had become. Sit down, he said. She sat. If the gap in surveillance is internal, he said, then the Castellano dinner is compromised in ways we cannot fully map right now. Caruso doesn't just know we're coming. He may know details of our positioning, who will be present, what we intend to communicate, and to whom. Then we change it, Clara said. We cannot cancel. Cancellation reads as retreat. I didn't say cancel. I said change it. She leaned forward slightly. Whatever you planned to present at that dinner, whatever the message was going to be, it needs to be different now. Because Caruso has already built a response to the version he was told about. She looked at him. He's prepared for the narrative, so we don't give him the narrative. Vittorio was quiet for a moment. What do we give him? Something he hasn't seen coming, something that uses the fact that he thinks he knows. She paused. I need to understand what he expects from me specifically. What does he think I am? Vittorio considered this. He thinks you are an arrangement, a symbol, someone produced to perform a function and then managed accordingly. He has almost certainly researched your background and concluded that you are no threat. Good, Clara said. That's what I need him to think when I walk in. Vittorio looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly. Something more like recognition, the way you look at something you were told about but are now seeing for the first time with your own eyes. Sleep, he said finally. We reconvene at 6. She went upstairs. She did not sleep. She lay on the covers and stared at the ceiling and thought about Enzo's face when she had described the gap, the flatness of it, the specific quality of a man who is controlling something large inside a very small space. She had read people her whole life, in quiet rooms, in her father's kitchen, in committee meetings where half of what was being said was somewhere underneath the words. She had read Enzo tonight, and what she had read was not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who had known something was coming and had not stopped it. Whether that made him complicit or afraid or simply old and tired and out of options, she didn't know yet, but she needed to know before they walked into the Castellano dinner. At 2 in the morning, she heard a knock at her door. She was already sitting up. Yes, Marco opened the door. He was fully dressed, which told her he had not been to bed either. His face had lost the carefully neutral expression, and what was underneath it was not panic, but was close enough to matter. Mr. Valenti would like you to come downstairs, he said. Now. She followed him. The study again. But different this time. A third person in the room, someone she hadn't seen before. A man in his 30s, compact and lean, with the particular quality of someone who had traveled urgently and recently and had not taken time to account for his appearance. He was standing near the fireplace, and when Clara came in, he looked at her and then looked at Vittorio. This is the person you're including? The man said. The accent was Italian, but the cadence was cosmopolitan. Someone who had moved between languages enough that none of them sat entirely naturally. Talk, Vittorio said. The man, no introduction was given, and Clara filed that, pulled a folded paper from his jacket. Not printed. Handwritten. He set it on the desk. Vittorio looked at it. Clara looked at Vittorio's face while he read it, because that was more informative, and she watched the thing she had seen earlier, the controlled fear, reassert itself with more force than before. He set the paper down. Read it, he said to Clara. She crossed to the desk and read it. It took her less than 30 seconds. The handwriting was small and precise, and the language was plain. It was a list of names, 7 names. Beside each name was a brief notation, a date, a role, a single-word description. She read all 7, and then she read the last one again, and the coldness that moved through her chest had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The last name on the list was Enzo Moretti. Beside it, the notation read, Caruso, 18 months, primary. She looked up. Vittorio was watching her. 18 months, she said. Yes. She did the calculation without wanting to. 18 months ago, Vittorio had been ambushed. 18 months ago, people had died and he had not. But he had come out of it in a wheelchair, and his empire had begun its slow fracture. 18 months ago, something had happened that required precise information, location, timing, personnel, that could only have come from inside, from someone with 23 years of access, from someone who ran communications surveillance and therefore knew exactly which channels to tell other people to avoid. He was the one who arranged the attack, she said. The words landed in the room with the weight of something finally named. The information in that document, Vittorio said, comes from a source I trust more than almost anyone living. He paused. It has been verified against 3 independent data points in the past 6 hours. Clara set the paper down carefully. She was very aware of her own breathing. He was here tonight, she said. He was in this room. You told him to document his own department. Yes. He'll know you're looking. Yes. Then why? Because if I react before I am ready, Vittorio said, he will run to Caruso and whatever is planned for the Castellano dinner accelerates into something we cannot contain. The gap between what I know and what he thinks I know is the only advantage we have. His voice was steady in the way of something that has been made steady through force, not nature. We have 4 days. Clara stood at the desk and looked at the list of names and thought about the morning's breakfast table and Enzo's leather face saying the Brescia situation. And she thought about 23 years and a man who had smiled the right way for 2 decades and reported everything to the person who eventually tried to kill the man who trusted him. And she thought about what that took. To do that. To sustain that. To sit across a breakfast table from someone for 23 years with that underneath everything. And she thought, I have been in this house for less than a week, and Vittorio still told me to read that paper. Why are you showing me this? She said. Vittorio was quiet for a moment. Because in 4 days we walk into a room where Caruso believes he has a complete picture of our position. He has Ferretti. He has Enzo. He has 6 weeks of prepared strategy built on information he trusts completely. He looked at her steadily. He does not know you. He does not know what you can see. And he does not know that you have now seen that document. She understood. You want me to go in there knowing everything and looking like I know nothing. I want you to go in there, he said, and find what I cannot find, because everyone in that room will be watching me. She stood there in the 2 a.m. study with the handwritten list and the low fire, and the man who had not slept, and the stranger near the fireplace who still hadn't been introduced, and she felt the structure of it settle into place around her. Not comfortably, not in a way that felt like safety, but in the way of a thing that has found its actual shape. She had come here as a symbol, as a performance piece, as the visual argument for a man's continuity. Now she was something else. She picked up the paper and looked at it again. The other 6 names, she said. Where are they? 2 are in the Castellano organization. 2 are external, financial. 1 is in my administrative staff here. He paused. 1 is Marco. She looked up. Marco was standing at the door. His face had the expression of a man who has known something for longer than he wanted to and has not known what to do with it, which was different from the expression of someone who was part of it. But different was not the same as clear. Marco, Vittorio said. Marco looked at him. Are you afraid of me? Vittorio said. A pause. Yes, Marco said. Good, Vittorio said. Then tell me what you know. What Marco knew took 40 minutes to come out, and it came out in pieces, the way things come out of someone who has been holding them under pressure for a long time. Not cleanly, not in order, with stops and reversals, and one moment where he pressed both hands flat on the desk and breathed through his nose for 30 seconds before he could continue. He had not participated. He had been approached 6 months ago by someone inside the organization and told to observe and report on Clara's activities once she arrived. Not to interfere, not to communicate anything directly to Caruso, just to report on what the new arrangement looked like from inside the house. He had not done it. He had also not told Vittorio. Why not? Vittorio said. Because the person who approached me, Marco said, told me that if I reported it, you would conclude I was part of it. And I didn't. I wasn't. He stopped, started again. I didn't know how to prove a negative. Clara looked at him. His hands were still flat on the desk. He was not performing this. She had watched enough performed contrition in her father's world of financial collapse to know what it looked like, and this was not it. This was the specific misery of someone who had made a quiet, private calculation about their own survival and had been carrying the weight of it ever since. "Who approached you?" Vittorio said. Marco looked at him. "Enzo," Vittorio said. Not a question. Marco nodded. The fire had burned low. Nobody moved to add wood. The room got colder by degrees, slow and inevitable. And outside the snow was still coming down, and Clara stood in the center of all of it and thought about Enzo going home tonight with the instruction to document his own department. And she thought about what a man like that does when he realizes the ground has shifted, and she felt something cold and clear move through her that had nothing sentimental in it. "He's not going to deliver the log," she said. Vittorio looked at her. "He's going to contact Caruso tonight," she said. "He's going to tell him the surveillance gap was identified. He's going to tell him that the Castellano dinner strategy needs to move faster." She looked at Vittorio. "Whatever they planned for that dinner, it's not going to wait for the dinner anymore." The room was very quiet. The stranger near the fireplace spoke for the first time. "She's right," he said, flat and without decoration. Vittorio looked at the fire. Clara watched him think, which was something she had learned to recognize. The particular quality of stillness that preceded a decision, not the stillness of paralysis, but of someone who had reached the bottom of the calculation and was about to surface with whatever it yielded. "We have hours," he said, "not days." "Yes," Clara said. He looked at her. "The dinner's in 4 days. We cannot move the dinner forward, but we can change what happens before it." "How?" "Enzo believes he still has time," Vittorio said. "He believes I will take at least 24 hours to process what I've found, because that is what I have always done. He knows my patterns." He paused. "He does not know yours." Clara understood before he finished the sentence. "You want me to go to him," she said. "Tonight." She looked at him. "You have read him 3 times now," Vittorio said. "Once in the study when you identified the gap, once when I gave you the document, and once tonight when Marco told us about the approach." He held her gaze. "I need to know whether he has already made the call. I need to know how much time we have, and I need him to believe, when you walk in, that you are there because you are frightened and inexperienced and made a mistake by identifying him, and you want to negotiate a way to walk back out of this house with the same safety you walked in with." The silence that followed was long. "You want me to act like a woman who is afraid," Clara said. "I want you to act like the woman he thought you were when you arrived," Vittorio said. "The one everyone expected, quiet, out of her depth, willing to make a deal to protect herself." She looked at the fire and then at the window and then at Vittorio. She thought about her father's kitchen and the men who smiled with the bottom half of their faces and the emergency exit she had never used. "If he's already called Caruso," she said, "and Caruso's people are already moving, then we will know that when you come back," Vittorio said, "because Enzo will tell you, because he will believe he has—" The last thing Vittorio said before she walked out the door was not advice and not instruction and not a warning. It was 4 words spoken quietly in the way of someone who has calculated everything available and is now operating in the space past calculation. "Come back," he said. Clara walked out into the snow. Enzo lived 12 minutes from the estate, in a house that was smaller than she had expected for a man of his position and tenure. Stone, 2 stories, set back from a narrow road behind a low wall and a gate that was not locked. She had asked Marco for the address, and Marco had given it without asking why, which meant Marco had made his decision about which side of this he was standing on, and that was one less variable. The stranger from the fireplace, whose name she had finally learned was Ricci, a name offered without elaboration, drove her and did not speak and did not ask what she planned to do when she got there, which she appreciated because she was not entirely sure. She had a story. The story was that she had panicked, that she had identified the gap in surveillance the way a person stumbles onto something in the dark, accidentally, without understanding what it meant, and that when she had spoken in the study she had not understood the implications of what she was saying, only that it seemed important to say it. That Vittorio had been cold to her afterward, that she was frightened of what happened to people in this house who became liabilities, that she wanted to understand the shape of what she had walked into, and she thought Enzo, who had been present and who had looked at her with something that felt, in her frightened and inexperienced reading of it, like someone who understood her situation, was the person to ask. The story was thin. It was supposed to be thin. A frightened woman's story was supposed to have gaps in it, was supposed to feel improvised, was supposed to be the kind of thing that a man like Enzo looked at and saw immediately as what it was. Leverage, maybe, or the beginning of a negotiation. And that was fine, because what she needed was for him to feel comfortable enough to confirm things without realizing he was confirming them. Ricci stopped the car 50 meters from the house. "I'll be here," he said. "I know," Clara said, and got out. The cold hit her immediately, the snow thinner now but still falling, the road empty and blue-dark in the way of rural roads at 3 in the morning. She could see a light on in the upper floor of Enzo's house. She walked to the gate and pushed it open and walked up the path and knocked on the door and stood in the cold and waited. The door opened faster than she expected. Enzo had not been asleep. He was fully dressed, jacket on, and in the 3 seconds before his expression settled into something controlled, she saw what had been on his face when he opened the door. Alertness. The specific alertness of someone waiting for news. And that told her what she needed to know before she said a single word. He had already made the call. He was waiting for a response. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I'm sorry for the hour," she said. She made her voice slightly unsteady, not overtly, just enough. She pushed her hands into her coat pockets so he couldn't see them, because her hands were steady and she needed them to not be visible. "I didn't know who else to come to." He looked at her for a long moment, then he stepped back. "Come in." The interior of the house was plain and functional in a way that surprised her, rooms that looked lived in without looking cared for. The accumulation of a person who had been somewhere else mentally for a long time. A kitchen table with papers on it that he moved casually as she came in, sliding them under a newspaper in a gesture designed to look like ordinary tidying. She noted the papers and looked away and sat down when he indicated the chair across the table. He sat. He had the quality of patience that very controlled people have, the ability to wait without filling the silence, and she matched it for a moment, looking at her hands on the table, letting him think she was gathering herself. "He frightens me," she said. "Vittorio." Enzo said nothing. I know how that sounds. I chose to be here. Or I chose it in the sense that the alternative was worse." She looked up. "But tonight, after the meeting with you, he was different, the way he looked at me. I don't know what I said that was wrong, but something was." Enzo's expression was calibrated to receptive. He is not an easy man to read. "No." She paused. "He asked me something after you left, about how I identified the gap. Who I had spoken to, whether anyone had given me information." She watched Enzo's face while she said this, and saw the thing she was looking for, a microsecond of calculation, the briefest tightening around the eyes. "I didn't know what he was implying. I still don't." "What did you tell him?" "That I read the letter," she said. "That it was in the language, that I didn't need anyone to tell me anything." She held his gaze. "But he didn't look like he believed me." Silence. Enzo leaned back slightly. She could see him working through it, the way you can see gears moving if you know what motion looks like. He was deciding how much to give her and what to take from her in exchange, and whether she was what she appeared to be. And she sat still and looked slightly lost and let him decide. "You identified something real tonight," he said finally, carefully. "The gap in surveillance. You were right." "I know," she said. "That's what frightens me, because now I'm connected to it." "Connected to it how?" "I said it in front of you, in front of Vittorio. I said there was an internal gap. And if someone was—" She stopped. Let the pause do work. "If someone inside was responsible for that gap, and now Vittorio is looking for that person, and I'm the one who pointed at the hole—" She shook her head. "I don't want to be in the middle of something I don't understand." Enzo was quiet for a long moment. The house made the sounds of an old house at 3 in the morning, a settling in the walls, the low hum of a refrigerator somewhere. His phone was face down on the table to his left, and she had noted it when she sat down, and she noted it again now because the screen had briefly lit when she was speaking, a notification, and he had not looked at it, waiting for a response, getting one, not wanting her to see. "You should go back to the estate," Enzo said. "In the morning, things will be clearer." "Will they?" she said. He looked at her. "Tell me honestly," she said. "Am I in danger here?" The question was designed to be answerable two ways. He could say no, reassure her, dismiss her concern, which would tell her one thing. Or he could use the question differently. He used it differently. The arrangement you came here under, he said, slowly and with the quality of a man choosing every word, was made with specific intentions. Whether those intentions continue to serve you depends on how the next few days develop. How they develop, how. He reached across the table and turned his phone face up and looked at the notification on the screen, and she watched him do it, and he did not bother to angle the screen away from her, which meant he didn't care if she saw the name on the notification, which meant he was past the point of pretending. The name was one word, Caruso. He looked up at her. She held his gaze and did not look away, and did not let anything move on her face. And inside her chest, her heart was hitting the wall of her ribs with a force she could feel in her back teeth. "You already knew," she said. Flat. Not a performance. Something changed in Enzo's face. The patience dropped, and what was underneath it was older and more tired and had the look of a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had just set it down. "Yes," he said. The word landed like a door closing. "How long?" she said. "Long enough that the specifics don't change anything now." She looked at him across the table. The newspaper was covering the papers he'd moved. The phone with Caruso's name on it was face up between them. The low refrigerator hum continued like nothing in this room had weight. "The attack 18 months ago," she said. He looked at the table. "He survived," she said. "Vittorio survived. You planned for him not to." Enzo's jaw moved. Not to speak. Just to move. The physical processing of something that had nowhere to go. "You don't understand the position I was in. Explain it to me." He looked up. Vittorio's way of operating had become untenable. The exposure, the scope, the refusal to adapt. There were people, serious people, long-term allies, who believed that the organization required a transition, that holding on to the structure he'd built for 30 years was going to bring federal attention down on everyone, not just him. He stopped. Caruso offered a managed transition, existing relationships preserved, people protected. A restructuring that was clean. Except Vittorio didn't die. Silence. "And you've been managing the gap between what you did and what happened ever since," she said, feeding Caruso information, keeping him positioned, waiting for the thing you started to finish. Enzo's hands were flat on the table. He was looking at her with an expression that was not guilt and was not calculation and was something she had not seen on his face before. Recognition. Like she had said something true in a way he hadn't expected to hear. "The Castellano dinner," she said. "What is Caruso planning?" Enzo said nothing. "Enzo." She kept her voice level. "What is he planning?" "It won't be at the dinner," he said. "Castellano would not permit anything at his event. The structure matters too much to him." He paused. "It will be on the road, coming or going. The route is... It would be managed, contained." Her blood went cold and stayed cold. "Managed how?" "This is not your concern. He's my husband." The word came out of her with a force she hadn't prepared for, and she felt it leave her and watched Enzo hear it and watched something move across his face that she couldn't name. "He is my husband, and you are telling me he is going to be killed on a road in 4 days, and it is not my concern." 3 days, Enzo said quietly. "They moved the timeline tonight, when I reported that the gap had been identified." She sat very still. 3 days. She had gone to his house to find out if the call had been made and to buy time, and the call had already been made before she left the estate, and it had already changed the timeline, and she was sitting in the kitchen of the man who had arranged to have Vittorio killed 18 months ago and who had been arranging it again for the past 6 weeks, and there were 3 days, not 4, and the snow was still coming down outside. She breathed. "Why are you telling me?" she said. Enzo looked at her. "Because you came here," he said, "at 3 in the morning in the snow. Not because you were frightened." He paused. "You came here because he sent you." She held his gaze. "And I'm telling you," he continued, "because I am tired." He said the word with the weight of something that had been true for a long time and had only recently been fully acknowledged. "I'm 67 years old, and I am tired, and what I wanted, what the transition was supposed to accomplish, has not been accomplished. Caruso is not a managed outcome. He is a takeover. What I helped him start has become something I did not intend. He stopped. That is not absolution. I am not asking for it. Good, Clara said, because I'm not offering it. He nodded once, like that was the correct answer. The route, she said, the one they're planning to use. He told her. She made herself listen without writing anything down because there was nothing to write with, and because she needed to be able to deliver it whole, without gaps, from memory, and she had a good memory, had always had a good memory, had used it in small rooms for small things her whole life. And now she used it here, in this kitchen, while an old man described the road where someone intended to end the life of the person she had chosen, had actually, genuinely chosen, to stand beside. When he finished, she stood up. You should leave, she said. Tonight, not in the morning. Tonight. He looked at her. If you're here when Vittorio knows what you've told me, the conversation will be different, she said. I'm telling you this not because you deserve it, but because a dead man can't testify, and I intend to make sure this ends in a room with lawyers and federal officials and evidence, not on a road somewhere. She looked at him steadily. Leave tonight. Go somewhere I don't know about. And when this is over, come forward. Enzo was quiet for a long moment. Why would I do that? He said. Because it's the only version of this where you get to be something other than what you currently are, she said. She left the house without waiting to see if he would follow the instruction. Ricci had the car running. She got in. The heater was going and the warmth hit her all at once, and her hands, released from her pockets, were shaking in a fine, constant tremor that she looked at with a kind of detached interest, the way you look at a physical reaction happening to a body slightly separate from yourself. Drive, she said. Ricci drove. She used the 12 minutes to do the only thing that was useful, which was to organize everything Enzo had told her into a sequence she could deliver without hesitation. The route, the timeline, the number of vehicles Caruso had positioned, the contact inside the Castellano organization who would confirm the arrival time. She held it all very carefully in her mind and did not let herself feel any of it yet, because feeling it was for after, and there was significant distance between now and after. Vittorio was in the front room when she came in, not the study. He had moved to the front room where he could see the driveway, which told her everything about the 12 minutes she had been gone and what they had cost him. He looked at her when she came through the door with an expression that she would think about later, when she had time to think about things, because it was not the expression of a man assessing an asset or evaluating a variable. It was the expression of a man who had been waiting for someone to come back. She crossed the room and stood in front of him and told him everything. All of it. The route, the timeline, the contact inside Castellano, Enzo's full account of the 18 months, and the phone with Caruso's name on it, and the words managed transition, and the 3 days that were now closer to 2.5 because it was past 4 in the morning. Vittorio listened without moving. He asked no questions while she spoke. His hands were in his lap and very still, and his eyes were on her face, and he did not look away once. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to feel complete. Enzo told you all of this, Vittorio said. Yes. Why? She looked at him. Because I asked him directly. Another silence. And you told him to leave. Yes. He was quiet. Something was working in his expression, something that had several things inside it operating at different speeds. He reached forward and picked up the phone from the arm of the chair and dialed a number, and when it answered, he spoke in rapid Italian for approximately 90 seconds and ended the call. Then he looked at her. The Castellano dinner is still happening, he said. I know. But we are not taking that route. I know. We are going to take a different route, and the people waiting on the original route are going to find a different vehicle. He paused. And inside that vehicle will be documentation. Every communication Ferretti sent to Caruso's people. The intercepted material from tonight. The contact information for the federal office that has been building a case against Caruso's organization for the past 2 years. A case I have been quietly providing material to for the past 14 months. Clara stared at him. You have been cooperating with federal investigators, she said. The transition I was building toward was never going to be accomplished through confrontation alone. he said. Caruso has too many resources, too many relationships, too many layers of protection. The only way to remove him permanently was to give someone with more authority than either of us the material to do it. He held her gaze. The Castellano dinner was always intended to be the moment where the last of that material was delivered, where the case became complete. And Enzo knew none of this. No one knew. She sat down. Not in a chair. She sat on the edge of the low table in front of him, which was not a planned decision. Her legs just made the decision for her. She sat and looked at him and thought about 14 months of building something in secret while the world watched him fracture and his enemies made their moves, and she had arrived here a week ago thinking she was a prop in someone else's performance. The dinner, she said. What happens at the dinner? The documentation is delivered to a federal contact who will be present as a guest of the Castellano family. He paused. Caruso will also be present. He attends every year. He will be expecting to complete the arrangement he believes is already in motion. He looked at her steadily. He will not be completing it. And when he realizes, Vittorio said, he will attempt to respond. In a room full of the most powerful families in northern Italy, with a federal contact present, and with the complete documentation of his operation in the hands of people who can use it. He paused. He will attempt to respond, and he will need someone to respond to. Clara looked at him. At the Castellano dinner, he said, there is a tradition. The heads of families are introduced formally. Their households are introduced. Alliances are announced. He met her eyes. When we are introduced, and Caruso sees that we are there, that the route failed, that the timeline he was given was wrong, his first move will be against the weakest visible target. She understood. Me, she said. You will not be the weakest visible target, he said. You will appear to be. The room was very quiet. Outside, the snow had finally stopped. The dark before dawn had the specific quality of absolute stillness. Nothing moving, the world paused between one version of itself and the next. If this goes wrong, Claire said, I know. I need you to tell me the full version of what wrong looks like. He looked at her for a long moment. If Caruso moves before the documentation is transferred, he said, the evening becomes something I cannot fully control. There are variables I cannot eliminate. Caruso's people inside the Castellano organization, the contact you mentioned, that Enzo identified. We don't know their assignment, protection, interference, something else. He paused. If they move against you, what do your people do? React, he said. But reaction is always a step behind. She looked at him. So I need to make sure they don't have time to move before the documentation is transferred. Yes. How long does the transfer take? The contact needs 8 minutes alone with the materials. In the context of the dinner, that means 8 minutes where attention is elsewhere. Where does it need to be? He was quiet. Vittorio, she said, where does the attention need to be? He looked at her with the expression he'd had when she came back through the door. The one that wasn't evaluation, wasn't calculation, wasn't the look of a man managing a variable. On you, he said. She sat on the edge of the table in the hour before dawn, in the house that had been a stone building for longer than either of them had been alive, and looked at the man she had come here to be a symbol for, and thought about a woman who pressed her thumbnail into her index finger on an airplane, and thought about emergency exits, and thought about how that woman had arrived here 7 days ago with a carry-on bag and a navy dress, and the specific particular courage of someone who does not make noise about the difficult things they do. 8 minutes, she said. 8 minutes, he said. She stood up. She was steady. The tremor in her hands from the car was gone, burned off somewhere in the past hour by something that ran hotter and more purposeful than fear. Tell me everything about the Castellano dinner, she said. The layout, the guests, the order of introduction. The Castellano estate sat on a hill above Lake Como, like something that had decided centuries ago that it belonged there and had never been successfully argued out of that position. Its lights were visible from the road below for the last 4 kilometers of the approach, warm amber against the December dark, the kind of illumination that suggested permanence, that suggested nothing in that building had ever been hurried or afraid. Clara sat in the back of the car and looked at those lights and breathed. She had spent 2 days learning the layout of a building she had never entered. She had memorized the names of 41 guests, their organizational relationships, their known allegiances, and the three whose allegiance was unknown and therefore the most important. She had stood in the long corridor of the estate at home, while Marco walked her through the formal introduction sequence 3 times, then twice more the following morning, until the order of it was in her body and not just her mind. She had sat with Vittorio for 6 hours across 2 days and listened to 30 years of organizational history compressed into what was necessary, what was load-bearing, what she could not afford to misread in the room. She had also, on the second morning, gone to Lucia. Lucia, who handled the household accounts and had told her that the easier you were to overlook, the safer you were, and who had a quality of stillness that Clara had noted on the first day and had not forgotten. She had gone to Lucia's office, a small room off the east corridor, and knocked and gone in and sat down and said, "I need to understand what the women in this world do in rooms like the one I'm about to walk into. Not the performance of it, the actual function." Lucia had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had poured 2 cups of coffee and closed the door and talked for 2 hours. What Clara had learned was not tactical, it was structural. The women who survived in the architecture of these families survived because they understood that the room was always reading them, and they controlled the reading, not through beauty or through performance of a role, but through the precise management of what they revealed and when. The women who didn't survive had either revealed too much or tried to disappear entirely, and both were mistakes. Visibility on your own terms was the only kind of visibility that protected you. Clara had sat with that and turned it over and found that she already knew it, had always known it, had been practicing a version of it her whole life in rooms that simply hadn't had these stakes. The car reached the Castellano gate. She looked at Vittorio beside her. He was in a dark suit, the same formal register as the night of their first meeting, but different in quality. Something that had been made for him recently, that acknowledged the physical reality of his body without apologizing for it. He was looking at the gate, and his jaw was set and his hands were still in his lap. He had the look of a man who had made his decision and was now simply moving through the consequences of it, which was the calmest kind of courage she had seen, the kind that didn't perform itself. "Ricci has the documentation," she said. "Yes, and the federal contact is already inside. Arrived an hour ago. And Caruso. His car was confirmed at the gate 20 minutes before ours." She nodded. She looked at her own hands, which were still, and thought about the trembling in the car after Enzo's house, and felt the distance between that moment and this one as something physical, like elevation change, like standing somewhere higher than she had stood before. "When we get in the room," she said. "I know," Vittorio said. They had been over it enough that they didn't need to say the rest of it. She knew what 8 minutes looked like. She knew the name of the federal contact, a woman named Andreotti, described as late 50s, silver hair pulled back, who would be seated at the third table from the east window, and who would receive the documentation from Ricci through a secondary entrance at the moment the introduction sequence began, 8 minutes from the start of the formal introductions to the completion of the transfer. Clara's job was to ensure that the attention of every person in that room who should not be watching the east corridor was directed elsewhere, specifically at her. The car stopped. A man in a dark jacket opened the door. Clara got out first, then waited while Vittorio's chair was brought around, and she stood beside him as they moved toward the entrance, and she was aware of the cameras at the gatehouse, and the men positioned at the perimeter, and the fact that her heart was doing something rapid and deliberate behind her sternum that she was choosing to interpret as readiness rather than fear. They went inside. The Castellano entry hall was exactly as Marco had described it, tall, stone, with the specific acoustic quality of a space that had been built to make arrivals feel observed. 2 men in the Castellano organization's employ greeted them at the inner door, one of whom Clara recognized from the photographs she had studied as the contact Enzo had mentioned, whose assignment was still unknown. He was a compact man in his 40s, dark-haired, with the quality of someone who had learned to be invisible in rooms like this and was therefore extremely visible to someone who was looking for exactly that quality. He looked at her. She looked slightly past him, at the room beyond, with the expression of a woman who was absorbing everything for the first time. Not stupid, just appropriately overwhelmed. She had practiced this expression in the mirror of her bathroom for 20 minutes the previous evening and had hated herself for approximately 15 of those minutes and then made herself continue. He looked away. She filed this. The main room was the ballroom, though ballroom was not precisely the right word for something that had the feeling of a space that had witnessed serious things over a long span of time. Round tables, 40 guests, the low sound of conversation that goes quiet and then resumes when new people enter, rippling outward from the door. The lighting was warm and the table settings were formal, and at the far side of the room, at a table positioned with the specific intention of commanding view, Lorenzo Caruso was already seated. She had seen photographs. The photographs had not communicated the fullness of him, which was a physical quality of density. He was not a large man, but he had the presence of something that had consolidated itself over decades, a heaviness that was not weight, but position. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, well-dressed, with a face that had settled into an expression of permanent assessment. He watched them enter. She felt his eyes move over her, and she let them, and she kept her face at the correct register, someone present, someone trying, someone slightly outside her depth in this company. And she watched in her peripheral vision as his expression completed its evaluation, and she knew, with the precise clarity of someone who has spent their life reading what people reveal when they think they're concealing it, that he had concluded she was not a threat. Good. They were seated. The dinner began. She ate. She drank, carefully, one glass of wine that she made last through the first two courses. She spoke to the woman beside her, a Castellano relation who wanted to discuss property renovation, and she was warm and appropriate and entirely present in that conversation while simultaneously tracking the room in the part of her attention she was not showing. She watched Caruso's table. She watched the compact man from the entry hall, who had positioned himself at the perimeter of the room. She watched the third table from the east window, where a silver-haired woman in her late 50s was seated and was, to all visible observation, engaged in quiet conversation with her table neighbors. Andreotti. Ricci was outside. The documentation was with Ricci. The secondary entrance to the east corridor was accessible from the garden, which was accessible from the delivery entrance on the north side of the estate, which Ricci had been inside an hour ago on a secondary pretext arranged by Vittorio's people that she did not have full details of and had chosen to trust. 8 minutes. The formal introduction sequence began at 9:15, announced by the Castellano family's senior representative with the precise formality of an institution that had been performing this ritual for longer than most of its current members had been alive. Tables were introduced in order, alliances acknowledged, families presented. Clara reached under the table and pressed her hand briefly against Vittorio's forearm once and felt him still. She stood up. She stood up before their introduction, before the correct moment. She stood up in the middle of the sequence, which was not done, which was not the structure of this room, and the ripple of silence that spread outward from her table was immediate and complete, and every pair of eyes in the room turned toward her, including Caruso's, including the compact man at the perimeter, including two other men she had identified as Caruso adjacent who had been positioned near the east corridor. Away from the east corridor. She spoke clearly, without raising her voice, in the tone of someone who had something to say, and had decided this was the moment to say it. And what she said was not what anyone in the room had anticipated. She said, "I would like to address something before the formalities continue, because there is a conversation happening in this room that has not been spoken aloud, and I believe it is more respectful to all of you to speak it aloud than to perform the evening as though it is not occurring." Total silence. She looked at Caruso. There is a belief, in some quarters, that the Valenti organization is in a period of instability, that its leadership is compromised, that the arrangements it has made are cosmetic, and that the woman standing at this table is one of those arrangements, present to suggest continuity rather than to represent it. She paused. Let that sit. I understand why that belief exists. I arrived here 10 days ago. I have no history in this world. I have no reputation in this room. She looked slowly around the tables, making eye contact for 1 second with each face that held still long enough, which most of them did because this was the most interesting thing that had happened at the Castellano dinner in several years. What I have is an education in the specific science of how people represent themselves versus what they are actually doing. And what I have seen in the 10 days I have been inside this organization is a man who has spent 14 months building something that none of you have seen because it was not built for display. At the third table from the east window, Andreotti set her napkin on the table and stood and excused herself with the quiet movement of someone stepping away briefly, and nobody watched her go because they were watching Clara. The Valenti organization has not been fracturing, Clara said. It has been documenting 14 months of it, the financial architecture of 3 competing operations, the communication records of the people inside those operations, the specific details of an attack on Vittorio Valenti 18 months ago that was planned from inside his own structure, and the identity of the person who planned it. The silence in the room had a texture now, dense and particular. That documentation, she said, has been delivered tonight to the appropriate federal authority. It represents a complete record. She looked at Caruso. Directly, held it. Complete. Caruso's face had not moved. That was the most frightening thing about it. A man whose face does not move when it should be moving is a man running calculations too fast for expression to keep up with. He stood. "This is a significant claim," he said. His voice was measured, conversational almost. The voice of a man who had been in difficult rooms for 40 years and had learned that the voice was the last thing to lose. From a woman who has been in this world for 10 days. "Yes," Clara said. "You'll forgive those of us with longer memories if we find the performance somewhat." He let the pause do the work his expression wasn't doing. "Theatrical." "I would find it theatrical too," she said, "if the documentation weren't already in the hands of the people who know what to do with it." Something moved in his face then, small and fast and then gone. But she had been watching for it, and she saw it. The moment the calculation completed and returned a number he didn't like. He looked past her at Vittorio. Vittorio was sitting at the table with his hands in front of him and his expression entirely still, watching Caruso, and the look between them was the look of 2 men who had known the full shape of something for longer than anyone else in the room, and were now, finally, in the last room it had to play out in. "You should sit down, Lorenzo," Vittorio said. Quietly. The way he said everything. Caruso did not sit down. The compact man at the perimeter had his hand inside his jacket. Clara saw it in her peripheral vision and did not look at him and did not stop talking, because stopping was the only thing she could not do. She addressed the room, the 40 guests who were watching this, with the stillness of people who understand they are present at something that will be spoken of afterward, and she said, "The federal authorities have been advised that any action taken inside this room or against the occupants of this room tonight will be treated as consciousness of guilt and will be included in the evidentiary record that is currently being processed." She paused. One breath. "I would encourage everyone to make considered choices about what they do in the next several minutes." The compact man's hand did not move further. She breathed. The next 4 minutes were the longest of her life and the quietest, which was its own particular kind of terrifying. The silence of a room in which everyone understood that the shape of things had changed and was waiting to see what the new shape was. Caruso stood and then sat, which was the critical movement, the visible concession, the moment the room read and filed. 2 of his people near the back moved toward the exit and were met at the door by men who had not been visible before, who were now, which told Clara that Vittorio's coordination on the outside had held. The compact man at the perimeter lowered his hand from his jacket and became very still in the way of someone who has chosen, in a specific moment, to stop. Andreotti returned to her table. She sat down. She did not look at Clara. She did not look at Vittorio. She picked up her wine glass and set it down again without drinking, a small, precise movement that meant the transfer was complete. Clara sat down. Under the table, in the dark, Vittorio's hand found hers and held it, and she gripped it back and felt the grip returned, and they sat like that while the Castellano family's senior representative, with the remarkable composure of a man whose institution had survived centuries of exactly this kind of evening, cleared his throat and suggested that they continue. They stayed for the remainder of the dinner because leaving was not the right movement. Caruso stayed too, because leaving was not an option he had that didn't confirm everything that had just been confirmed. The conversation around the tables resumed with the quality of something trying very hard to sound normal and not entirely succeeding. And Clara ate the remaining courses and spoke when spoken to, and kept her face at a register she had to actively maintain because underneath it something was shaking that she was going to deal with when she was not in this room. Caruso was arrested at the gate on his departure by federal agents who had been positioned there since 8 o'clock that evening. She learned this from Ricci, who told Vittorio by phone in the car on the way back. And Vittorio listened and said 2 words and ended the call and looked out the window at the dark road and the lake visible below them in the December night. She looked at his profile. "It's done," she said. "Most of it," he said. "What's left?" He was quiet for a moment. "The legal process. The federal case will take time, the organizational restructuring. What comes after Caruso's removal is not automatic. There are claims and counterclaims and relationships that need to be renegotiated." He paused. "And Enzo." Enzo had left the night Clara told him to. He had gone somewhere she didn't know. And 3 days later, one day before the Castellano dinner, he had contacted a federal office and identified himself and offered his testimony. She had learned this from Vittorio the morning of the dinner, delivered as information without commentary, without any visible feeling about it. She had not asked him how he felt. She had understood that the question would have been unkind. "He'll testify," she said. "Yes. And the case against Caruso becomes complete." "And the case against Caruso becomes complete," he repeated. She looked out the window at the lake. "Your father's debt," Vittorio said, "was cleared the day you signed the arrangement. The legal exposure, the fund issues, that was handled through the attorneys 6 days ago. He has been notified." She had not known about the 6 days ago part. She was quiet for a moment, processing it. "Did you tell him what I was doing, the dinner?" "No?" She nodded. "Clara." He said her name the way he had said it in the study that first night, with the particular weight of someone who has not said a person's name very many times and is aware of it each time they do. "The 2 years." She looked at him. "The arrangement specified 2 years," he said. "As of tonight, the terms have been met in every material sense. The organizational purpose has been served. The federal cooperation is documented. You are—" He stopped. Started again, which was the only time she had seen him do that. "You are free to decide what comes next." That was always the agreement. The car moved through the dark and the lake was below them, and the lights of Como were small and scattered on the water. "I know what the agreement said," she said. He was quiet. "I'm telling you," she said, "that I know what it said. I'm not asking you to remind me of the terms." A pause. "What are you telling me?" She looked at him. At the profile and the set jaw and the silver at his temples, and the hands that had been still in his lap when she walked out into the snow at 3 a.m, and that had held hers under a table while a room full of people decided what kind of men they were going to be. "I'm telling you that I came here with a carry-on bag and a dress I bought 3 years ago," she said. "And in 10 days, I identified a surveillance gap, exposed a 23-year betrayal, walked into a man's house at 3 a.m. to extract information from him, stood up in a room full of people who could have had me removed in ways I don't want to think about, and held 8 minutes of attention while your federal contact completed a transfer that took down a man who has been trying to kill you for 18 months. She paused. "And I did all of that in a world I had never been in before. So I want you to consider, carefully, whether you think this is something I did because I was obligated to under a contract." The silence that followed was long. "No," Vittorio said. "I don't think that." "Good," she said. "Then stop referencing the terms." The car turned off the lake road. She could see the estate walls in the distance, the gate and the old trees, the lights at the windows. She had arrived at those gates 10 days ago, with her thumbnail pressed into her palm and her stomach in a configuration that had nothing peaceful in it. And she looked at them now from the back of a car and felt something she did not have a word for except that it was made of every difficult thing she had done in the past 10 days, and it was fully hers. The weeks that followed were not easy, because nothing that involved lawyers and federal timelines and the restructuring of an organization that had spent 30 years building its architecture was ever going to be easy. There were mornings when she sat with documents for 6 hours and evenings, when she attended meetings where half the people in the room were still deciding what they thought of her, and she sat with that uncertainty and did her work and let the deciding happen on its own schedule. There were phone calls with her father that were short and complicated and left her feeling the specific tiredness of a relationship that had been fundamentally altered and was going to require years of small decisions to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt. There were days when the weight of what she had walked into and what she had done inside it sat on her chest like something physical, requiring actual management. And there were other things. There was Lucia, who had become something Clara didn't have a previous category for. Not a friend exactly, not a colleague exactly, something that operated at the intersection of both and was developing its own specific shape. There was the slow process of understanding the organization not as a thing to navigate, but as a thing she was, whether she had intended to be or not, part of the function of. There was the correspondence she managed, and the meetings she attended, and the moments when she said something in a room, and the room changed because of it, and the feeling that came with those moments. Not power exactly, but competence, which she had always had, and which now had a context that matched its scale. And there was Vittorio. There was the morning 3 weeks after the Castellano dinner, when she came to the study with a set of financial documents she had spent the previous evening analyzing and found him at the desk not reading or on the phone, but simply looking out the window at the snow, which had returned and lay thick on the grounds. And she had stopped in the doorway and looked at him for a moment before he heard her. In that unobserved moment, he looked like what he was, which was a man who had carried something very heavy for a very long time and was in the specific period of adjustment that follows setting it down. Not relief exactly, not peace, but the tentative exploration of what the body feels like when the weight is gone. He looked older than he did in the study, with his jaw set and his hands still, and his expression doing the work of impenetrability. He looked like a person. Then he heard her, and the expression reassembled, and she crossed the room and put the documents on the desk and stood there while he looked at them. "The Ferretti assets," she said. "His cooperation with the federal case entitles him to certain protections. But the financial agreements he had with Caruso's organization are documented in the materials already submitted. This column," she pointed, "represents the amount recoverable without triggering a counterclaim. This one is the exposure if we move before the primary case is formalized." He looked at the documents, then at her. "You're recommending we wait." 3 months, she said. "Possibly 4. The primary case establishes the framework and the recovery becomes automatic rather than contested." He was quiet, reading. She stood beside the desk and waited, and in the quiet she became aware of the snow outside and the fire behind her and the smell of the room, wood smoke and paper, and the faint medicinal trace she had noticed the first night, which she now knew was the specific compound used in the treatment regimen for his back, which he did not discuss and she did not ask about except in practical terms when it affected scheduling. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said, which made the corner of his mouth do the thing it did, the involuntary thing, the thing that had been gone before she could be certain of it the first time she saw it, but was now something she could anticipate. She gathered the documents, started to turn. "Clara." She stopped. "Sit down," he said. Not an instruction. The tone was different. She sat. In the chair across the desk, the one she had sat in the first night, though the desk between them felt like a different object now than it had then. He looked at her for a moment in the way of someone who has thought about what they are going to say long enough that saying it is now the uncomfortable part. "The flowers," he said. "The first night. I told you I had them put there, and then I didn't explain it further." She looked at him. "I had read the file on you very thoroughly, Tet," he said. "The graduate degrees, the withdrawn applications, the university library. The Tuesday cooking class." He paused. "The cooking class was... I noticed it because it was the one item in the file that was purely for yourself. Everything else was for your family or your career. The class was just something you wanted." He looked at the desk. "I wanted you to have something in the room that was not functional. That was not part of the arrangement." He paused again. "The flowers were a poor version of that." She sat with this for a moment. "They were white," she said, "and they didn't have any scent. I was told they were appropriate." "They were extremely appropriate," she said. "That was slightly the problem." He looked at her. "Next time," she said, "something yellow. Anything with a scent." She paused. "If there is a next time." "There will be," he said, quietly, without decoration. She looked at him across the desk where so many things had been said and not said over the previous weeks, and she thought about the woman on the airplane and the woman at the gate of this estate and the woman who had stood up in the middle of the Castellano dinner's formal introduction sequence and held a room still for 8 minutes, and she understood that those were all the same woman and that she had always been this and had simply needed a context that was large enough to hold it. "All right," she said. She stood. She put the documents under her arm. She went to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame the way she had on the first night, And the gesture had its own kind of history in it now, layered over the memory of the first time. Vittorio. Yes. Enzo testified this morning, she said. The federal office confirmed it. The primary case is formally opened. A silence. I know, he said. I know you know, she said. I'm saying it anyway. Because it happened, and it was hard, and the things that are hard and actually happen should be said out loud. She heard him breathe, just once, the specific quality of a breath that is doing more than breathing. Yes, he said. They should. She walked out into the corridor where the house was going about its morning. Lucia's voice somewhere in the East Wing, a phone ringing in Marco's office, the sound of the ground staff on the steps outside managing the snow. The estate was alive in the particular way of something that had been threatened and had not been ended, which is different from the way a thing lives that has never been threatened, more deliberate, more aware of itself. She walked through it toward her office, which had been her sitting room and was now both, and she sat at her desk and opened the next document and began working. And outside the window the snow lay over the grounds and the old trees stood in it, and the gate at the end of the driveway was closed, and the world on the other side of it was doing whatever it was doing. And inside this house, inside this work, inside this life she had not chosen, and then had Clara Whitmore, who had once pressed her thumbnail into her palm on an airplane and looked at the emergency exit and not taken it, put her pen to paper, and stayed.